Hi, I'm John Beaver, and welcome to my wave bowl demonstration. I've never lived more than 2 miles from the Pacific Ocean. And so when I got into wood turning, I was looking for inspiration. I was looking for what's my story? What can I bring to the field? And thinking about the ocean, thinking about surfing, kayaking, swimming, body surfing, all the things I've done in the ocean, and just spending hours on the beach watching the waves. And the waves have this rhythm and this motion and this energy that I was trying to capture. And it's really neat when you put that energy on a round piece. There's no beginning and end to the design. The design just continues forever. And so I felt that that would be a neat thing to bring to wood turning. But how do you do it? And so I had to figure that out. And that took me a while. I tried different things and this and that. And what I finally ended on turns out that it is by far the easiest and the easiest to do other things with it. So very fortunate as an artist and as a professional wood turner to have come up with a signature design that I can manipulate a number of ways. And tonight we're going to do two projects for you. The first one is this basic wave bowl, and I call that a basic wave bowl. The wave is flush. It starts with a square block of wood, a square block of dry wood, and then we cut it up and we bend a piece of wood into the groove to make it fit. And then that's dried. And this is a project that if you follow along and pay attention, and you can do this yourself. You can do this with the tools that you have. It doesn't require any extra jigs. You do this with a lathe and a bandsaw. You can make this piece. The second piece we're doing tonight is what I call the protruding wave bowl. So in this case, the wave sticks out. So this changes the dynamics of how we do it quite a bit. This is from one piece of wood. This is a piece of walnut. It's bleached to give it some contrast, but the protruding part is not bleached. So therefore it gives it some nice contrast. And so you see it from far away and you can tell what it is. This requires some extra steps and some challenging steps, but doable. But hopefully, whether you make this piece yourself going forward, I think some of the things I do to make it work, I think you'll appreciate, and you'll maybe be able to bring to some of your own work and some way to keep things aligned. So if you look at my work, the wave is a signature, and it's a strong signature, but I think the genesis of the work I'm doing is the ability to take a log, a wet wood, free wood, turn it into a bowl, let it dry, and then return it, and then cut it up, manipulate it, add elements, subtract elements, change elements, and then just as challenging is getting it back together with all the grain and walls and everything aligned. So some of the steps I do pertain to this, but they also pertain to a lot of the other work I do. So I think you'll appreciate some of those. One last thing to talk about is the shapes that I do. And you'll notice that all of my wave bowls have this closed rim. So the wave bowl comes out and comes back into a closed rim. And there's two reasons for that. One is when this sits on a table, you want to be able to see the design. So if it's an open bowl, then that design is facing down onto the table and you're not able to see it very well. So by placing it in the right perspective, when this sits down on the table, put it on the board here, and then you're able to see it real clearly. Secondly, as you'll see real shortly, when I cut this wave, if you look at it from the top down, it becomes an oval. And so if I'm looking at it from an open bowl, then it's not a wave on the inside, it's an oval on the inside. But by closing the rim, it makes it so you can't see it. You can't look down and see the oval because it hides the design when you look straight down on it. So you have to look at it from this side perspective, which then creates the illusion that there's a wave on the inside as well. And I play with the inside and outside with a lot of my work. I tie the inside and outside together. So in a piece like this, I feel like there's a dark brown interior that's projecting through the wall and creating this dark brown. So that tying the inside's brown, the outside's brown. I have a bleached exterior. I have a little bit of showing of the wave on the inside. And so I'm kind of tying the insides and outsides together on the vessels and trying to use 3 dimensions on the outside as much as I can. So with that, let's show you guys how we do this, because I think that's what you're all here for. Okay, so I'm going to show it to you on paper, and then I will show you how we do it on the block of wood. If you were to take a square block of wood and cut an arc into it, and cut this arc, and then add a piece of wood in place of it and put it back together, that's going to give you this bowl. If you look, you can see this shape. That's the cut arc. If you look on this side, it's cut upside down. So you can see how that works. The beauty of this solution is in its simplicity. It allows me a lot of room for manipulation. I can take the top and lift it up, the bottom lift it down, and play with the space in here to a degree. The bandsaw blade's about a 1/16 of an inch kerf, but I can go up to a 1/4 inch of elements in here. I can put different pieces in here and play with that and get away with it. Where if you did a compound curve, if you cut a compound curve, you're extremely limited. You can't separate these items. You can't split them. You'll get gaps here and gaps here. There's no way to avoid that. So if you do a compound curve, all you can do is replace the curve with the saw kerf, which is about a 1/16 of an inch piece of wood, and you're kind of fixed on that. So that would also be, there's more challenges. Trying it with a jigsaw to cut around a bowl and make all that happen was really, really difficult. So discovering this and being able to use it just opened up tons of doors for me. We're going to start off today with a block of wood. This is hard maple. It's 16/4 and it's about 5 by 5 inches. And just dried hard maple. Has to be dried because you have to glue the joints and you can't glue wet wood. So real important that you get dry wood for this. I can buy hard maple really affordably at a big lumber yard in downtown Los Angeles, but sometimes it's a 12-foot board, sometimes it's a 16-foot board, and you have to buy the whole thing. So you can't buy small pieces of it, but if you have a source for buying dry wood, then you can do this. Really important to me to keep everything square and tight, and everything that you can control, you want to control. So if you start, this isn't actually perfect, there's a little bit of a twist to it, but if you start square and you start planed and you start flat, then as you're cutting it, things stay balanced. And if you have a mistake, it minimizes the mistake. If you start crooked and you start not square, then everything gets multiplied down the line and things get worse. So we want to start off as tight as we can. All right. So the first thing I want to do is I kind of want to know where I'm going and where I'm going to cut this arc. And if you look at this bowl, you can see that there's a high point to the arc, to the side of the bowl, to the shape there. And the wave pretty much splits that. And that's about 1/3 of the way down the bowl. It's just a nice number to work with. If you want to get into golden mean and golden ratios and split it up perfectly, you can take that extra step. But I find if I take the height of the bowl, divide it by 3, when I turn it, I put the point of the apex of the arc at about that 1/3 of the way down and basically split that with the wave. It's a really nice balance. We also want it balanced left to right because that way it's the same distance from the top and bottom everywhere you go. So we look at this wood, it is 5 inches, I guessed right. And so let's find the center point of it here, 2.5, 2.5. And let's just show that so I know where it is. So when I draw the arc, it's relative to that center point. I also want to find now that 1/3 of the way down the bowl and balance everything off of that. So we know we're going to have a 10 in here. And so I'm now dealing with the bowl that's from here to here, which in this case is just about 3.5 inches. So if I go 1, and a 1/6 right there, and go another 1 and a 1/6. We're gonna be right in there. Actually, I think I missed that. Let me just go to the other side. Oh, that's about, I can go a little higher there. That's about where it wants to be. And I use millimeters and inches interchangeably. Sometimes this is 90 millimeters, 9 centimeters. Easier to divide that in 3 than 3 and a half. So come over here and we'll use the millimeters, and we'll set the same thing over here, and we'll draw this line. And you'll see that there's some interest in the wood that is going to play into effect. One thing I forgot to mention, and I'm going to back up for 1 second, and that's real important, that the wood has growth rings. And in this case, I'm going to identify the growth rings as frowning. Even though they're not centered, if they were centered and they'd be perfectly centered and frowning, that would be better. But generally, they're in a frowning motion versus if I flip it over, they'd be what I would call a smiling motion. And physics with the compass forces me to draw this in a frowning motion. And it looks better when the arc follows the growth rings to a degree. So this is frowning, and I'm going to cut it the same way. So I set the bowl up to accommodate for that. I just forgot to mention that earlier. So now we're just going to take a look at where the ball is going to be. So that's how I'm going to turn it. Come over here. And that just gives me a sense of looking at it so I can see where I'm going with it and see how it's going to be and see how it relates to anything else in the wood that's interesting. In this case, I really like this stuff. It may help me. It may be really nice. It might have been prettier in some case to have all the interest down below so the wave cuts across a planar part. So I'm splitting the difference there between the wave following the growth rings and then placing the figure of the wood appropriately. And those are some design choices that you can make as you go forward. So now we want to draw this arc that we're going to cut. So I'll take a secondary block of wood right here, and I'll transfer this line down it. So now I have a line that continues down. I did that in pencil just so I can erase it on this one later. And then I'm going to take the compass, and I'm going to set the compass points. And this is real important. The radius of the arc. So the compass, the distance between the compass points, needs to equal the diameter of the bowl. So in this case, I have a 5-inch bowl, and I want to have a 5-inch radius between the compass points. So I can just come in here and use the bowl as a guide and set it. I could take it on a ruler and set it to 5 inches as well, but in this case, it's just real easy to set it here. You can fudge on that by a little bit. You can go up and down by maybe 1 inch, but if I went to 6 inches, it's going to get too flat. It's not going to look enough like an arc. If I get to 4 inches, it's going to be too steep. And what happens is it's too steep on this side, but on the sides it flattens out. It doesn't look like a balanced wave. So ideally, if you can, as close as you can get the diameter, the radius of the compass point to equal the diameter of the bowl, that's going to give you your best balanced piece. And what I'm looking for is this arc to essentially split this line here. I can go a little bit above it. If I miss it, I can always turn the top down when I'm turning it and fix it. But I can find it right now, and I'm just going to put a point here. Look at how it's above here. Look at how it's below there. So that's a little low. So we'll bring it up probably about here, and that looks about right. Okay, so I'll set my compass point down here and draw this line. And I don't know how well you can see that. If I turn it here, you can see it better. So this is where the cut is going to happen, right there. And that's perfectly, should be the same distance from here, and then it'll be balanced really nicely. One more thing before I go forward, or two more things actually. Before I cut it, I want to set my center point. So when I put it on the lathe, I know where the centers are, top and bottom, and little indents. So it goes on the lathe real easily. So we're going to draw the center. Ideally, you would do this with a pencil so you can finer points, but you can see it better if I use a pen. And we'll take the awl, go in the point, and establish that. Please don't take the awl and hit it with your hand. It's really bad for the hand. Don't want to do that. Always just use pressure or a hammer. So we flip it over, do the same thing on the back side. And if you want to use a center finder and measure this more accurately, you're welcome to. Again, the more precise you are with everything, the better balanced the final piece comes out. So now I have nice points, top and bottom. When I put it between the lathe, it's got nice centering on it. And lastly, I'm cutting an arc. So now when I clamp this, I have, rather than flat pieces, I have curved pieces. And they're going to want to slip around quite a bit when I put them. If I put a clamp here, it's going to want to pull that top down and the top this way. And I'm going to put another piece in the middle. So I've got multiple pieces that can, multiple pieces that can slide around. And so I need to come up with a way to keep them lined up so all the grain lines up, everything stays square, everything goes in place. And my solution for that is to drill holes and use dowels. And it's real simple. If you're looking at the arc here, the dowel, if the dowel lines up with the high point of the arc, it's where it's the flattest rather than being curved and close to the edge of the bowl. And it has to work the least amount of distance. I only have to get it to here. So I'm going to take this line and basically establish it on the top of my bowl. And then just inside the bowl that will get turned away later, we're going to drill holes for dowels. If you can do this on a drill press, I highly recommend it, because if the dowels are not parallel and not perpendicular, you're going to have a tough time pulling the top on and off. So if the dowels are kicked out, you can't slide something down that. And if the dowels are kicked in, the same thing. Also, if they're not perpendicular, you can slide it, but it's more challenging. It just doesn't go together as well. So real important to get these as straight up and down as you can. I'm going to use a hand drill because I don't have a camera on the drill press right now. And I've done this a number of times and can get it pretty good. But I recommend, again, using a drill press when you can. So and I'm just eyeballing that. I know that that's going to be deep enough. I didn't measure the depth. If you're on a drill press, you can measure the depth stop, get it exactly right. But that should be fine right there. All right, so there's my dowel holes on the top. And then the dowels are just going to slide into them. And you'll notice that the dowel doesn't slide in very well right now. It doesn't want to go in. That's because if you buy store-bought dowels, they're very rarely measured exactly right. I find that the 1/4-inch dowels that I buy are almost always slightly large. And so I could go the next size up drill bit, go one drill bit over a 1/4 inch, or I could put it in my drill. And take some 80 grit sandpaper and spin the drill. And make the drill a little bit smaller. You can put on your lathe and turn it. Good luck with that. I don't think that's going to work very well. And then you can kind of burnish it in if you want, and just make sure it fits properly. So there's just some tricks with the dowel there. We'll set that aside. We don't need it for now. When we cut this, we don't want to cut through the dowel. So I'm going to take this over to the bandsaw and we're going to cut it. And just bandsaw safety. This is 4 inches of hardwood. I'm using a 1/4 inch blade. I use generally a 10 to 14 TPI blade, so it gives me less offset. It gives me a smoother surface because that's what you're going to glue back together. And today I'm actually using a 6 TPI blade. It'll work fine. But just, you know, you're cutting pretty heavy piece of wood. you want to be really slow and steady. The slower you go, the smoother the cut's going to be. The faster you go, the more ridges the offset's going to put into it. And so you want to get yourself comfortable and set, and you're thinking an arc. You have an arc here. Rather than thinking pushing down a line, you're thinking rotating around the arc. So take that into account when you cut these. I have lifted my guide up so you can see, but you want to always keep the guide as low as you can. When I cut this, when I get to the end, I cut out very, very slowly because I don't want to, I'm putting a fair amount of pressure on it to cut it, and I don't want it to pop out and cause a problem. So we're going to cut nice and patient. So anyway, there's the lineup. I can turn this on and get my body in a comfortable position, set myself, be ready to do this, and here we go. Two other little items. First of all, that's pretty nice. So I'm feeling it. I'm feeling for bumps and ridges and things like that, and I feel pretty good. It's a little bit of an extra piece there. When the saw blade comes out, it always leaves a little bit of a ridge. You can take that down with sandpaper or a hand plane and get rid of it. You have to be smooth and steady, and you want to do it in one pass. Every time you stop the saw, it's going to leave a bump. And so if you have a bump here, it means you have a recess here. And if you were to sand that bump off, then you've got a gap. Also, the wood that's bending isn't going to fill in, so you're going to end up with a gap somehow. So you don't want to ever stop. If you're cutting down this line and you get off the line, let's say you're drifting a little bit high, just correct it slowly. Don't try to come back down quick. Just correct it real slowly. And maybe you even end up high over here. And the worst case is the wave's not 100% balanced properly. But if you've gotten everything else right, you've squared the wood up, you've squared the fence up, the tabletop of the bandsaw, and everything's good to go, then it should still work. You'll notice I cut off that pencil line just about perfectly. So that should be a really nice balanced wave. So the last thing is we need to now fill that gap with something. And I like maple and walnut, and I happen to have a 5x5 piece of walnut here ready to go. So we're going to put the walnut in here and we're going to clamp this down. But if I were to clamp this right now as it is, this is going to break. We're going to break the walnut, and we don't want to do that. So we're going to steam bend the walnut to make it soft enough so I can bend it into the form. And since we're to do that, rather than making a steam box, which is an awful lot of work, you need to build a big box, you need to boil water, you need to get the steam into the box and cook it for a long time. Since we're wood turners, round things and bowls fit really well in microwave ovens. We're going to steam bend this in a microwave oven. Before I do it, I'm going to talk for a couple minutes about bending wood and grain direction. I could teach a whole class on it, trust me. Don't want to bore you to death on that, but I do want to address a couple things. We worked off the end grain of this piece of wood. So therefore, the grain is running this way, okay? There's the grain running this way. So I need this wood to run the same way. I don't want to cross it. I can't have 90-degree crossing wood in wood turning. When you take the center out and you have an open bowl, it's going to breathe. The wood's always going to breathe. It's going to breathe across the grain. So if it's breathing across the grain this way, but across the grain this way, they're fighting each other and the joint is going to weaken. So you need the wood to be running the same direction, okay? Which means, in this case, it's real easy because I'm bending it across the grain this way. If I had done the cut over here, and there's sometimes a reason why I would want to do that, then I have to bend the wood the other direction. Just changes how you bend it and what you do with it. Last thing to talk about before I bend it is the type of wood we're bending. I highly recommend sticking with North American hardwoods. Maple, beech, birch, cherry, walnut, oak, ash, they all bend great. Mahogany bends really nicely. If you start getting into exotic woods, a lot of them just don't bend well. Bending Padauk, bending ebony, they don't work the same. They're harder, the grain doesn't hold together as well, and you're gonna have a lot more issues with them. So I highly recommend the wood you're bending here, North American hardwoods. This is 1/8 of an inch. I make them myself. It's milled very accurately, and that's real important. If you don't have the tooling to make something as thin as this, and so I'm running it through a drum sander that's real specific and real accurate. It's a company in upstate New York called Certainly Wood. They have a really nice website, and they sell non-paper backed veneers. Real important that if you use a veneer in wood turning, you don't have the paper on it because it's not strong enough. But they also sell them thicker. They sell a 1/10 of an inch and a 1/16 of an inch. So if you wanted to buy the wood, you could go on their website and buy some 1/16 or 1/10 inch thick non-paper backed veneer. And the beautiful thing is that because we're just using the edges of it, we're not so concerned about the figure. If you're buying highly figured wood from them, it can get kind of pricey. But if you're buying walnut in a 1/16, you're talking about 75 cents a square foot, because all we need is the plane. And so it's really affordable, and it's a pretty easy way to go. So there's an option for you. Or you can just take thinner veneers that you buy in any store and stack them. So there's lots of ways to make this work. All right, so let me show you the microwave technique. I'll take the microwave tray over here. It has some water on it because I used it earlier today. I take some paper towels. I put the wood in the paper towels, and I'm folding the wood over to make a cocoon. I don't want the steam to escape. So I want to really get the wood in there nice and tight so everything stays in there like that. You can do this in your microwave in your kitchen because it's not like you're drying wood or boiling wood. It doesn't make any smell. It doesn't hurt the microwave at all. The only problem is that you need to have clamps in your kitchen counter, because by the time you get the wood from your kitchen to your shop, it might be cooled off too much and not bending still. So I highly recommend getting a microwave for your shop. Craigslist, you can usually find them for about $25. I got mine 10 years ago for $25, and it's still working great. So good purchase, and it keeps me out of the kitchen and keeps my wife happy. You want to get this wet. It doesn't have to be saturated wet, but it has to be pretty wet. The wood has to be completely wet. If you pull this out of the microwave and the wood's starting to dry and you're starting to see dry spots on the wood, then you either haven't used enough water or you've heated it for too long. So there's a couple things to keep in mind. So I'm going to take this over to the microwave, and I'm going to do this for about 1 minute and 15 seconds. It's a really good number to start with. You can go up or down by 15 seconds, depending upon how thick your wood is and depending upon what species. Walnut's a pretty standard species. Cherry's going to react about the same. If you're doing a porous wood, you may heat it for less. If you're doing a little bit of a denser wood, you may have to heat it for more. You can also soak it a little bit longer to get the water to penetrate a little bit more, but I think this is going to work really nicely. And we're going to put that in for 1 minute and 15 seconds. And while that's in the microwave, and I probably should have done this ahead of time, but I had them pretty close to ready. I'm going to get my clamps ready. I'm going to have the clamps ready and have it standing by. Have everything dry fit. Make sure that your clamps will fit the piece that you're doing. If you grab clamps that are too small, then you got to go find bigger clamps, and you're going to lose the time because you have about 45 seconds to work with this wood when it comes out of the microwave. So real important to have everything ready to go. So what I'm going to do is I bring it out of the microwave, slide it in, bend it, clamp here, and that's going to form the bend in the wood. This comes out of the microwave. This is hot. I'll do it right here so you can see it. So you can see it's pretty wet still. So when I take it out of the paper towels, and you could use a rag if you don't want to waste the paper towels, It's nice and wet. Oh, it is hot. Woo! How about that? Haha. Okay, so now it's also already kind of starting to bend by itself. You see it's got some form to it. That's the direction it wants to go. It's already starting to dry up here, so we need to move pretty quick. So we put it in here. We squeeze that like that. We take this clamp it on the bottoms. And that's real important. Let me just put the microwave tray away real quick. When I cut this, there can be a little bit of relief from it, and this can start to flex upwards. And when I put the steam and the wetness from this in it, it could cause this top piece to warp even more. So if I'm clamping the bottom, pulling it down around the curve, then this stays intact. If I were to put clamps in the middle and not on the sides could lift up. And then when I'm gluing this back together later and clamp these sides, I could actually split this right here. So important to clamp it this way. 2 clamps is plenty for this. If you want to use 4 corners, that's up to you. But these are just small, lightweight clamps. They don't need to do a lot of work right now. Not that important. All we're doing is forming and stretching the fibers so they get some memory and they stay close to this. When you take this apart, it will spring back a little, but you've already stretched it, so it's going to go back into this place real nicely. So once this is set in this form here, you want to leave it like this for a couple hours. You're just making sure that you're stretching the fibers and making it do its thing. I recommend 3 or 4 hours. Once you've gotten it that far, you need to continue and finish drying it because the moisture in there hasn't been able to escape completely yet. So after that 3 or 4 hour period, I'm going to loosen the clamps up and just set them down, but not take it apart completely. So I'm still keeping the form to a degree, but now I have airflow in here. And now the air can get out, the moisture can get out, and this can dry. And that's going to take a couple more hours. So you've started this at the beginning of the day, you're going to have to wait for a while, let the air get out, wait for a while more. And then once it's completely dry, you can glue it. You cannot glue wet wood, it just doesn't work. So once this is all dry and ready to go, the last thing you have to do is get holes through the veneer for the dowels. And so I'm going to do my best to line this up by eye. If I'm off a little bit, it doesn't make that much of a difference. And now I'm going to clamp it back together. So again, this is already dry. We've waited our time. And what I'm doing now is I'm giving support to the veneer so when I drill a hole through it, it's not going to break. It's not going to split. All right. So now I'm going to put my 1/4 inch drill back in my drill bit, back in my drill. And I'll come over here. And this is a real light drill. Usually I just hold the drill down and just let the weight of the drill go through it. I don't want to force it. I don't want to, because if you force it, that veneer will split. So if you take your time, let it cut slowly, let the cutter of the drill do its work. You come in here and I'm going to cut through and just stop about right there. If I'm lined up and it finds the bottom hole and it goes in, great. If I'm not, it's going to just nick the top. And that's fine. And then when I put the dowels in, everything will line up properly. But if I'm a little bit not lined up right now, then it might just slip a little. So we're just going to go really light and slow. Just like that. That was a high speed and it went through real easily. And they actually found the hole below them really nicely. So now we take the dowel and we're going to cut these with these handy little, they're called handy cut cutters. There's a couple brands of them. It's a heavy duty utility blade here, great for cutting dowels and popsicle sticks and things like that. So you're going to cut that. Cut the second one. So now we're going to take it apart. And now we're ready to glue it. And so there's the bottom. Since I drilled these holes by eye and didn't measure them, they might not be perfectly balanced. So if by chance I were to take this wood and flip it and put it in the wrong hole over here, you can see it doesn't cover all the wood. There's gaps here. It's not perfectly set. So before I do that, I'm just going to take my pen and mark some up arrows on this, and up arrows on this. And that way I know that everything goes that direction. All right. So all you need to do now, you put your glue on here, stick your dowels in. If they're parallel, that you'll be able to slide everything on it real nicely. This comes over the top, slides down. This comes over the top, slides down. So now you just have this incredibly positive mechanism where all the grain and everything is perfectly aligned. And now you do the same thing with your clamps. And if you want to use 4, I recommend it, 1 in each corner. And you clamp that up, and then you let that dry. So PVA glues, they need to clamp for an hour, but you want to let them dry for 24 hours before you stress the joint. So once this is clamped, just put it aside, let it sit, come back tomorrow, the next day, turn your shape, and you've got yourself a nice finished wave bowl. This bowl is exactly this piece. This was actually a demo piece, cut by hand and bent wood, and I took this demo piece and glued it up and finished it and made this bowl. So this is exactly the piece you'll get here. You're welcome to use different species. You're welcome to use different veneers, any look you want. But I think if you follow it along, you should be able to do this project without too much trouble. But a very limiting piece. You can only make this out of it because you have to start with a block and you have to turn it, and there's nothing else I can do. I can't make it protrude. I can't mix it up. Also, I'm limited to dry wood, which means I'm limited to the species available of dry wood, which are going to be only a couple. Out here in California, I'm going to get maple, poplar, cherry, probably walnut, and not much else in 16 quarter. It's also expensive. If you were to go to a 10 by 10, 16 quarter piece of walnut to make a bowl out of, it's going to cost you $100 in wood. And so I wanted to be able to manipulate the piece a little bit more, and I wanted to be able to work with free wood. So I want to be able to get a log off the street, turn it, get it dry, and then play with it. And so I call it kind of segmented turning with dry wood. So this is a piece of acacia that comes from this local park next to me. They happen to have a lot of acacia there, and they let me come in with a chainsaw when pieces fall, and they call me when pieces fall so I can get access to their wood. So this was free, and I rough turned it and I let it dry. And then this afternoon I put it back on the lathe and rounded it back out, and very importantly, squared the top up so it's really square. And so now I want to basically do the same thing with this. And what I'm going to do, we're going to make this piece, and we're going to cut it now twice. We're going to cut the top and a second cut below the rim. So one cut here, one cut there. We end up with 3 pieces: top, a little ring, and the bottom. I'm then going to remove the ring and set it aside. Take the top and the bottom half, put them together, put them on the lathe, and turn them smaller. So then when I put the ring back in, the ring will not have been turned smaller, and that's what's going to give me the protruding part to it. But there's a few things that have to happen before I make it that easy. So I just need to plug in my hot glue gun. But the number one issue is cutting this. You cannot make that cut by hand on a bandsaw on this piece of wood. And it would be incredibly dangerous. First of all, you can't track the cut because you don't know where to start it and where to end it. So following it would be next to impossible. Secondly, you've got nothing to support this. So as soon as the bandsaw blade hits the back of the wood, it's going to roll it into the bandsaw, and you are not as strong as your bandsaw. You can't stop it. So the bandsaw blade is going to roll it in, and then what's going to happen? It's probably going to kick it back up. It could hit you in the head. It can roll your hands into the blade and cut your hands, and it can damage the saw blade. What my goal was to come up with a way to be able to cut this safely and then accurately and repeatably on some mechanism where I don't have to cut this by hand. So what I'm going to do is I've come up with a jig. I'm going to show you the jig. I'm going to just show you the components of it and how it works. And then I'm going to do a few things to the bowl because it has a few more prep work to do before I cut it and turn it smaller. And you'll see all that as we go along. And so I'll show you the jig. I'll prep the bowl, and then I'll build the jig on the bandsaw, show you all that, exactly how to use it, and then we can do the work on it. All right. So jig consists of 3 parts. The first part, let me come to this other camera here. I think I can do it better over here. I can leave this a little bit wider here. So the first part is essentially a circle cutting jig. So holes, and I apologize for the extra holes in this. This has traveled with me to many different clubs and many different teaching shops, and we've had to modify it for different projects throughout the time. And so, but right here, these holes are about 1/2 inch apart. So every 1/2 inch is going to give you 1 inch different circle. And it just has a bolt here that gives me a circle cutting. So just a standard circle cutting jig. On the back, I have a bar that slides into the miter slot of the bandsaw. And so that keeps it positioned, keeps it lined up, and that goes on the bandsaw table. Next up is what I call the swivel plate. And again, this has holes in it that allow me to position it on the bolt, just to accommodate the size of the bowl. I may want to bring this back, I may want to bring this forward, but these holes are just there for positioning. So I find a nice set of holes, drop it over the bolt, I put a nut on, and now I have this nice circle cutting jig that can hold something. So I could put a piece of square, that previous piece we did, I could put this on here and now cut this on the bandsaw. Take off this back bolt here real quick. And now comes the magic. And that is this top carriage. So this is 90 degrees. Just use wood here to brace it. On the bottom of this are some splines that go into the grooves on this swivel plate. All right. And on the front of this are some holes. And those holes happen to be 1 1/4 inches circle. And I happen to have a 1 1/4 by 8 threads on my lathe. So you can see where there's going to tie together. And the height of these, this one is about 3 inches up. So it would handle a 6-inch hole. And this one is half the distance of the height of my saw. And I have a pretty tall bandsaw for my 3rd bandsaw. And so I can come up here and make a pretty big bowl that's going to fit. So this carriage sits on top of this plate. And it gets put on with a washer and a wing nut. And now it can slide. So I can adjust it. All right. And then using a combination of a 1 1/4 by 8 bolt and nuts, a 1 1/4 by 8 reverse chuck adapter with a Morse taper on the back. This would sit into your tailstock, 1 1/4 by 8 threads, or this little piece that I've come up with that I took off of another tool and put my own handle on. And this goes into that bottom hole. And then we take the chuck and we thread it on here. And then we take the bowl and we mount it in the chuck and we clamp it down. So now I have this apparatus that allows me to cut not only the arc, but almost any cut I can think of safely, accurately, repeatably. I can put that bowl wherever I want. So if I slide it forward, bandsaw blade's here, and there's my arc. There's my wave arc right there. If I wanted to cut an angle on the bowl, I could lock this in this position using the miter bar on the bottom, slide this through, and cut this off. I could take this top carriage off and hand hold it and do hand cuts on this. So I've now come up with a device that allows me, again, to safely, accurately, measurably, repeatably cut almost any cut you can think of on a bowl. And that's what we're going to use. But before I do that, I need to do a few things to the bowl. So I'm going to take it out of its thing. I'm going to set this aside. We'll come back to it a little bit. And I'm going to prep the bowl for cutting it apart and putting it back together. And in the previous bowl, we had the dowels, slid everything together with dowels, but you can see the issue here, there's no place to put these dowels. I've intentionally left my rim a little bit thicker so I can turn this down and still have plenty of meat left to work with. But I need to get something in here to allow me to align it. I can't attach it to the outside because I'm going to turn the outside down, so they have to go on the inside. So what I'm going to do is take this tool, contour gauge, profile gauge, whichever name you want to go by. You've seen these before. You set a shape here and that shape pops out on the other side, and you can easily transfer a shape from one thing to another. So I'm going to take the inside profile of this bowl, and as I've turned this bowl, I've made it so it's pretty smooth on the inside. When I turned it, I made sure there's no ridges and mostly no ridges. So I can now get the inside profile really nicely, and you can see it right here, and you can see that it's smooth and it's nice and steady. So there's my inside profile. I'm then going to come over onto a piece of MDF, and I'll explain why the MDF later, but I'm going to take the MDF and I'm going to set this profile gauge on here and use a pencil and draw that shape. Draw the piece of wood, the shape that I just made. Bottom doesn't matter, so I'll just turn that away right there. And I'm going to cut this, so there it is. I'm going to cut this on the bandsaw or a jigsaw, and I'm going to cut just perfectly down that line. I'm going to erase the pencil line. This takes practice. You need to get this right. If this doesn't fit perfectly in the bowl, it's going to cause you some problems later. There's a little bit of correction you can do to it, but you really want to get it right the first time. So you want to just take your time, make a couple of these until you're really happy with it. So I'm going to make the first one. And once the first one's done, then I'll make a second. I use that as a template to make the second one. So we'll pop over to the bandsaw again. And I'm just going to come over here. And again, I'll leave my guide up so you can see. And I'll do my best to cut right down this line. So here's this piece, and we're going to come over here and test fit it and see how it looks. And if you saw me when I was doing that cut, the back of the wood actually got hooked up on something. I left myself kind of a bump, and I want to fix that. So I'm going to take a pencil and run it up here, and I'm going to scribe it in. So if you look really carefully, let's see if you can see it. Right here, you can see that the pencil line just left myself a little tiny bump right there that I don't like. So I'm going to take this over to a disc sander. I apologize, you won't be able to see me do it. I'm just going to bring that down to the line real quick. So hopefully I've scribed that in really well now, and there's the fit that I'm going for. Super, super tight fit inside here. The one other thing I have, if you look, you'll see that it's sticking above the rim of the bowl, and I'm going to have a plate on here for clamping this later, and I can't have that protruding, so I'm going to take a pencil and put a line on it, and I'm going to cut this line off. When you cut small pieces on a bandsaw, rather than trying to push them with one hand, if you clamp it with your one hand and push that other hand, it's a relatively safe way to do it. The best way would be to put this in a wood clamp and push the wood clamp through, but I think I can get away with this. I hold it with this hand and push with that hand. The reason that was protruding was because when I put the profile gauge in, it wouldn't quite fit straight. I had to lean it forward to get it to work. And so that's why I had to cut this top off, and that's why it ended up looking like that. But now I can look and make that fit, and I can see that that fits really, really well. So now I'm going to use that as a template to make a secondary one. Oops, pop that in real quick. So there's the second one, and we'll go over and cut that on the bandsaw. So now we're going to fit this one, make that fit really nicely, and we can glue these in. If you notice, this is square and this is round, and they don't match up perfectly. So I use hot glue to fill that gap. You cannot round this to fit. It's absolutely impossible, trust me. I've seen many people try in classes and stuff. You can't do it. I could knock these corners off by a little tiny bit. I mean, just a barely kiss on a disc sander, and I will do that sometimes to get it to suck up a little bit tighter. But with enough hot glue, and you'll see what I do with the hot glue, this is going to work fine. The last thing to do is determine where they go on the bowl. And when we worked with the block of wood and we dealt with the growth rings and we wanted the wave to follow the rings of the wood, this wood's not that specific. It is turned face grain, but it's just really not that specific. But right here, I can either come over the top of this or I can come over the bottom of that little circular section there. Let's turn it over, see if that makes a difference. So I'm looking right now just to see if there's anything on here where the wave is going to follow the bowl better or worse. This is kind of vague. There's nothing special and specific here. So I think I'll probably set it right about here. So again, where the dowels on the square block came at the high point of the arc, I want them to do the same. So this is where I want the dowels to go. I'll end up with there. I'm not assuming the blocks. So the blocks are going to hold the dowels, okay? So that's where we're going to put these. So now we take the hot glue gun, that's hopefully hot by now, and we're going to be extremely generous with the hot glue. We want it to spill out. We want it to squeeze out. We want to have excess of it. Careful that it's hot and it can burn your fingers. So be careful when it drips down the sides how you're holding it. But you can see I'm using a ton of it. Using the high heat hot glue. Don't use the low heat. It doesn't matter if you use the opaque or the clear as long as it's the high heat. So now that I've got that here, first take a little popsicle stick, scrape the excess off the top because I don't want that to get in the way later. And then in the sides here, there's some spill out, some squeeze out. And I want to kind of squeeze that in and make a little bridge and fill it on these corners to help hold this. And these are real critical later. So it's really important to get these right, because that piece that I cut out of there is going to be a 1/4 of an inch thick, and it's going to be real easy to break this off. So those little bridges right there that I just created, those little fillets are going to do a whole lot of help holding this. So you probably hold it for 30 seconds or so until it starts to cool. If you let go too early, it will still slip around a little bit. And if you don't have enough glue squeeze out, let's just say there wasn't enough squeeze out on one side, I can take the hot glue and add some more in there and then mush that in with the popsicle stick. And that will just give me a little bit of extra help holding that. So that first one's done. Let's do the same thing with the second one. Here we got a hot glue gun that works really well and pulls it really nicely without slipping. Take good care of it because they're few and far between, trust me. We're going to hold this for about 30 seconds while the glue sets. And while we're holding it, we can clean the excess glue off the top and then press the squeeze out into the corners on the inside to make the fillets. You'll see later how much these fillets help when we cut the bowl into pieces. But again, the same process here. Still a little extra on there. Get that in there really nicely. Okay, and we're going to hold that. I want these pretty straight up and down, but they don't have to be perfect. As long as they're in the neighborhood, they'll work fine. For this particular piece, I'm making 2 cuts. I'm going to have 3 pieces, and that middle piece is about 1/4 of an inch thick. And so 2 of these on it should be fine. I should be able to manage this without breaking one off. If I'm doing a piece that has multiple layers, many layers and many small pieces and 1/8 of an inch pieces and stuff like that, what I'll do is I'll make another set of these and I'll put them over on the side somewhere and I'll drill them, but I won't use them unless I break one off. So they're backups. So if I break one, that gives me an option for the backup. All right, so now that I've got these ready to go, I'm going to drill holes in them that the dowels are going to go into. And again, if you can do this on a drill press, I recommend it. The one issue with the drill press is you have your base of the thing might be kind of small. And so as you push this here, it can roll over. So figure out a way to stabilize it really steady so when you're using a drill press, it doesn't roll on you. I'm going to do this by hand. So right in the middle and straight, again, perpendicular or parallel. Again, the depth isn't that critical. You just have to get past this line. I probably went about that deep, but as long as you're clear of this by 1/2 inch, you're fine. The only thing to be aware of is that you don't drill into the bowl. I had somebody do that the other day. He sent me a picture. He said, I did everything right, but he drilled too far and damaged the bowl. So when he was done with the bowl, he had a couple of nicks from that in it. Now, the dowels make a little bit more of a difference on this piece. I'm just going to steal the dowels from there. These dowels can't stick proud of the face because, again, I'm going to put a plate on top of here and when I clamp it all together. And so I want to make sure that these aren't proud. So I'm going to drop that in. Usually just put a little pencil mark on it. Pull it out. So there's my pencil mark. And I'm just going to cut a hair below that pencil mark or right on it. Just a little below is a good spot. And then I just put that one on this hole here. And I don't know if I drilled both holes equal. And I also want some registration marks just visually to keep an eye on this bowl later. You'll see that when I put it on the lathe. So I'm going to mark one of these up. I don't know if you can hear in the background, there's an ice cream truck coming down the street. Anybody want ice cream? I'll take a break. And then I'm going to take this dowel and mark it also black. And so I know that this dowel goes in that side. And then I'm going to take a second dowel over here, mark it with a pencil. Pull that out. Cut that below the line. And I'm going to take these out and we're just going to set them aside. I'm not going to cut, I don't want to cut through them. So we're just going to put these aside and we'll use them later when we're ready to turn this and glue it and everything else we do to it. These go back on, this thing comes apart and back together many, many times during the process. All right, so I'm now ready to cut this. So let's go back over to the bandsaw, set the jig up for the bandsaw so you get to see the process again of all the parts, and then we'll do some cutting. All right. So I'm going to take this whole bottom section apart, lift this off. There we go. So the first thing we need to do is set this bottom plate and this pivot point. So again, the diameter of the bowl, the radius of this arc equals the diameter of the bowl. And in this case, I can just stick it in here by eye and look at it, and that just about fits perfectly. But I could have measured it and done it. I was probably between this hole and this hole, so I had a little choice there. And just for simplicity for tonight, I kept it in this hole. But I might go in to the next one. And sometimes I'll build it, and you can kind of visualize what it's going to look like, and you can make an adjustment to that. But I think for tonight, that hole is pretty nice. So the next step now is to balance this with the blade. And this is absolutely critical. You've got to get this right. The cut happens on the teeth of the blade, the leading edge of the teeth of the blade. The rest of the blade is just supporting the teeth. So everything has to be relative to the teeth of the blade, not to the middle of the blade, not to the gullet, to the teeth. And that center hole where this thing rotates needs to be lined up with those teeth. So if I take, and I have a little bit of a line there, you probably can't see it, but the center of the hole, slide that up and touch the teeth of the blade. And that's my relationship right there. Now I'm going to clamp this down. So I'm going to take this clamp and reach through the camera here. And put it on the front corner of the blade of the I'm going to put the clamp on the front corner here because as this plate swivels, if I have a clamp back here, it could hit that clamp. But the front corners are where you want the clamps to go. So this plate clears them as it swivels. I'm just going to use one for now. I recommend the second one on the other corner. And I'm going to double check my centering. Make sure that after I glued it, or I clamped it, excuse me, that I'm back to where I want to be. And I didn't slip it any when I put the clamp on. So that looks pretty good, okay? If these holes are off, then your circle is not relative to this point. Your circle is relative to a point over here, and it's not a perfect circle. So if you're ever doing, for example, just rounding blanks and you have a circle cutting jig for rounding your blanks and you find the bandsaw blade is wandering off, pulling off or pulling in and not tracking properly, it's because you haven't lined it up, the point of the circle up with the blade. All right. So now we're going to take all this section, which is already put together, and I'm going to drop this, and these holes again are just to accommodate it, and I'm going to drop this onto the bolt. And I want to make sure that these corners clear the blade, so that's a good hole that I chose. I'm going to come and clamp this down. And then we're going to tighten that down. And you can use a lock washer, and you can use a nylock nut if you want. It's as you're moving it back and forth, it tends to want to loosen itself up. So tight enough where I can still slide it easily, but also so it doesn't have any play. So that's a pretty nice number right there. I feel pretty good about that. I have my chuck in place, and my chuck, I made sure I set the key to the side, because if I put it on the top, sometimes I can't turn it because you can't quite see that, but it's going to hit that. So Anyway, I want the checks off the side. And I'm going to lock that check down and use some vice grips on it. Pull back a little bit so you can see. So I want this tight because as it starts to cut, it wants to unthread itself. And I don't want that to happen. So I tighten that down really tight. And then we're going to mount the bowl in there, which is right here. I've set these blocks so I know that's my top and bottom, and I've set a little mark there about where I want the wave to go. So we're going to use that as the top. And we're going to put that in and line that up as high as we can so that this little part, we chose this as kind of an identifying element that we wanted to work off of. So I want to make sure that I'm centered on that really nicely. So that's perfectly vertical. And now we tighten this down. Okay, so now this is built, ready to go. Next step, slide the carriage forward until the blade is touching the face of the bowl and it's touching the top and bottom equally. If you've got a gap, top or bottom, you have to figure out what the issue is. Maybe you set the plate on some sawdust or something and it's leaning, or maybe just the weight of it is bending this, or maybe you're not perfectly square. If they're not lined up to the blade, you can tilt the table of the bandsaw and accommodate it. So I could rotate the table left or right and make sure that I want it touching top and bottom, because that way, when I cut here, it's also the same equal distance on the bottom, so it's a nice balanced piece. If I'm not touching the blade squared up to the blade, then on this side, the wave could be higher than on the other side. So that's what I'm looking for right there. So now, take this off real quick. I need to set marks for where the cuts are going to happen. And I'm going to do this on the jig and kind of backwards and upside down so you guys can see it. So sometimes I get it a little bit off. But on the top here, on this green piece of tape, you'll see there's a line. And that's just a registration line. If I move this carriage, you'll see that line moves. All right. So let's go back up, touch the blade, lock the carriage down, take a piece of tape and put it on the bottom. So I can put some marks on it. Okay. So now the first thing to do is to establish that first mark. And I'm going to use a Sharpie for this. I highly recommend using a finer point like a pencil or something so you can be more precise. But I want you guys to be able to see what I'm doing better. So I'm taking this first mark here and I'm transferring it down below. And I usually put an E next to that. And that tells me that when this line is lined up with this line, the edge of the bowl is touching the blade. Okay, hopefully you can all see that. A little sloppy on there, but I think you can see what's happening. Now we're going to take the ruler, and I'm going to take this mark that we drew for where we want the top of the wave to go, and I'm going to use the ruler and measure that. And I usually use millimeters for this. I just find it easier to remember 15, 14 millimeters than 17, 30 seconds or something like that. It's easier to find on the ruler. And that's a little bit high, so I'm going to try. And again, there's an apex of the arc of the bowl over here. And I'm trying to kind of split that, which I feel pretty good. So I'm going to come down to about probably 17 or 18 millimeters. So let's just say 18 millimeters. That feels pretty good right there. So now I take the ruler and set that at my 18 millimeters. Oh, sorry, I wasn't showing you that. Let me go back and do that again. So what I did is I took the ruler, I set it at 18 millimeters on that first mark. And then I drew this line here. So from this mark forward is 18 millimeters. And that's where the first cut's going to happen. Now I need to establish the second cut, which is going to be about 1/4 of an inch, roughly. So I'm going to go maybe a proud quarter with, again, the Sharpies can't be as accurate as I'd like. But anyway, right there. And so there's my second cut. So edge of the bowl, first cut, second cut. If I'm doing multiple cuts, I take a lot of time and measure them and lay them out and make sure they look right to me. In this case, we're only doing 2 cuts, so I can make an adjustment just by my eye for the second cut. But those are target marks, but I'm going to try to hit them right on. You'll notice that I can't rotate the bowl because the blade's in the way. So I'm going to now loosen up the bolt back here, slide the carriage back, rotate the bowl so it's clear of the blade, and rotate up to the first mark here. So we line that up, we lock that down, and now I'm ready to do the first cut. Like we did on the square block, this cut has to be absolutely smooth and steady. If I stop the saw, it's going to leave a divot, and that's going to be a problem. So I want to make sure that I'm absolutely smooth and steady. So I want to get my body in a comfortable position where I know I can reach the whole way around and make it. If I'm in the wrong place, I have to move my feet, it's going to be a problem. And as I get to the end of the cut, I'm going to reach across behind with this hand to stabilize the top so it doesn't fall into anything. And there's a little bit of a risk there. I'm getting my hand fairly close to the blade, but I'm coming to the back of the blade. So the worst case is I might burn the back of my hand. I'm not going to cut it off, but just be aware, you know, and if you have a friend that can help you with that, it'd be nice to have a second set of hands on this. So let's give this a shot. I'm going to drive it with my left hand primarily. Get your body in a comfortable position. So if I look at the tracking here, it looks like the blade tracked just perfectly along the bowl, which means that I got my center point correct. If I didn't have the center point correct, as I got to the end of the cut, it would be working harder because I would be forcing around a bend that's not natural for it. So I feel really good about that. It's nice and smooth. I'm going to set that aside. And then we're going to drive it forward to the next mark. And that's going to be my second cut. Okay, so we do the exact same thing. And this way they'll blend and they'll be perfectly parallel. They're going to look great. Couple things to talk about here, just thinking of as I'm doing this. Once I put the bowl in the chuck to return it and flatten the front of it, I try to leave it in that chuck until it's done, until it's time to turn around and remove the tenon. So if you're taking a bowl in and out of a chuck, every time you do it, it's going to maybe line up a little bit differently. So I'm really careful to address that. Couple things here. So here's this little ring. You can see that there's only 1/4 of an inch holding these on. And so those little fillets on the outside, I'll show these on the close-up, do quite a bit of work. So you can see here that this glue on these corners is helping hold this quite a bit. Otherwise, you just have this gap of glue and it'd be real easy to break these off. So I feel really good about the smoothness of this. I feel really good about how it came out. If you look real carefully, you can see a little bit of a dark line right there, maybe a hair here, but it's more prevalent on this side. And what that's from is as the bandsaw was cutting the hot glue, it heated the hot glue and dragged it down the bowl. And so you just come over here, you could wipe that off with your finger later. All right, so now I have my top, my bottom. I have my ring, which I'm going to set aside. Let's go widen this out a little bit here for you. Okay, so this is just going to get set aside. We're not going to touch this for a while. And I have my top. So if I put a dowel here and slide this over that dowel and put this on the bandsaw, put this on the lathe, I can now turn this smaller. But if you look carefully over here, you'll notice that there's a shift here. This circle is bigger than here because we've taken out this space, and because of the angle of it, as this drops straight down, it makes this larger than this. And so if I were to turn it smaller right now, it would leave me with a wall going behind that protruding part that's not lined up properly. I would take more wood off of this side and less wood off the bottom, and I'd get this shift. So we need to add that distance back in. So we need to lift it up there so these all fit. And I can't use this because I don't want to turn it smaller. So I have to create a spacer that fits in here that holds it apart like that when I turn it smaller, okay? And to do that, I've taken, this was probably used in another bowl because it already has some holes in it, but it's a 1/4 inch spacer. And if I did it right, its thickness is pretty close to the thickness of the part that we just removed. In this case, it's a little bit less. So if I'm doing this for a hero piece, I'm gonna mill this exactly the same as this. Take it onto a drum sander, keep it flat, and make it exactly the same thickness. So I'm taking out the right amount of gap. I use for this more softer woods, poplar, pine. In this case, this is Doug fir, and it works great for this. So I've got a circle. This is going to end up getting steam bent and put in here, and then the top's going to go on top of it. I don't want to try to cut some arcs that match. They won't be parallel enough. So by milling it perfectly and bending it, it keeps it the exact correct thickness, and it works out great. So I need to get some holes in this to clear the dowels. So I'm going to set the top on upside down, and you'll notice that it's slightly proud. I want it to be slightly proud because I want it to support all the edges of this so I don't get any tear out when I turn it. All right. And I want to make sure grain direction's correct so it bends the right way across the grain. And then I'm going to take a dowel of an awl and establish some holes. And the second one's going to be tricky because it's probably already close to the real holes. Okay, so I'm going to put them, hopefully that'll work right there. And I'm going to drill those out. And I'm going to use a little bit bigger drill bit this time. If I do these 1/4 inch and they're really tight, when this steams, if it shrinks or moves a little bit, it's going to be problematic. So I'm just going to give myself a little bit of room. So rather than the 1/4 inch bit, I'm just going to go to a slightly larger drill bit. That's not critical what size it is. Just a little bit bigger. And I'm going to drill these 2 holes. Okay, there's 1. There's 2. And let's make sure those fit properly. Yep. So those holes are going to clear right there. This is my black side. So I'm going to mark this with black so I know it goes with the side of this that I've scribed. And because I have these extra holes in it from another piece that I made, I'm just going to put a little arrow at that one so I know where that goes. Okay, so those are the holes we're going to use. We're now ready to take this over to the lathe. So I have a clamping block for the top. And I have all my pieces, my top, bottom, my spacer, my dowels, and we're going to go over to the lathe. So the first thing is to mount the bowl on the lathe. Double check the tightness of it, make sure it's tightened down nicely. Come in a little bit so you can see that a little bit better. All right, now we're just going to dry fit everything, make sure it's all ready to go. So the dowels go in, dowels go in. This isn't bent yet, so it's not going to fit perfectly, but that's going to go there. And then I'm just going to look at this and kind of fit it upside down. And what I'm checking for here is to make sure that my dowels aren't sticking out too far. And this one actually is, so I need to cut that one off a little bit. The cutters. And I'm just going to cut this dowel off by a little bit. It can't be protruding. Oops. I feel like I grabbed the wrong dowel, maybe one of them. I didn't mark one of those dowels black earlier. I don't see that. So I must have grabbed a different dowel off my desk. So let's do a second test fit here. Make sure everything works. So I must have grabbed the wrong, like I said, I must have grabbed the dowel that was the wrong size. Okay, so those are clear. They're not sticking out. So now that's going to work. And then I have this plate on the top that's going to hold it all together. So now I'm going to steam bend this piece, come back over, put it all together. A little tricky with one set of hands. If you have a friend or a spouse that can help you, that's really nice. I think I'll be able to get it. So with everything ready to go, really lined up properly, so I don't have to think about it. I can move really quickly and put it all together quickly. So I'm going to go get that plate from the microwave. So now we're going to take this microwave plate back over here. And I'm just going to do it here so you can see it one more time. We're going to take this piece here, wrap it up in the paper towels. Fold the paper towels over. Get it nice and wet. Flip it over here. Get it nice and wet. And now we're going to go steam this. And when I come back, I've got about 45 seconds to put this all together. So it's going to happen pretty quickly. So what I'd like to do is bring the whole tray over while it's, so I bring the whole thing over in the tray, so I haven't opened it up yet. I'm just going to put it on a stool right next to the lathe. And open it up. Again, it's hot. Be ready for that. Woo! That's really hot today. That microwave is working well today. Okay. So have all my marks, so I know exactly which way this goes really quickly. It's ready to go. So we take this, get the holes lined up, take this top plate here, slide the tailstock in, clamp it down really hard, and we turn this until it's tight. Okay, so all I'm just doing here is adjusting it, making sure it's tight. This is all pressure fit. The dowels are there for alignment, but they're not really holding it from sliding. They might help. I mean, they're going to give it some help, but the fact of the matter is it's just pressure fit. I've never had, if everything's right and you've done it right, I've just never seen an issue with them. They don't want to come apart. The only time we have a problem with them is when your tailstock doesn't clamp down tight enough and the tailstock can back off, and then it can get loose and it can wiggle. If you have a tailstock that's a little bit lighter weight and it wants to slide backwards, what I'll do is I'll take a piece of wood and a clamp and clamp the wood on the ways to stop the tailstock from backing up. So there's a solution for that that's pretty easy. The other thing to mention is every now and then when I spin these, and that one sounds real nice, I'll get a buzzing noise. We'll get a bzzz, and what happens is the face of the bowl isn't true. It's got turned or warped or something like that. And so if this plate, this MDF that I'm using in this case, isn't touching this perfectly, it can't follow this circle. And so it's gonna wiggle and wobble. And that's the noise that you hear. But again, if you get everything square and right and you keep it in the chuck like we talked about, then everything should run true, okay? I use MDF on the top there. You could use plywood or a hardwood if you want, but I just find MDF, it's waste wood, it's cheap and easy to get rid of. So one more issue now. I want to turn this bowl down by about 1/4 of an inch. I know it's hollowed. I know it's thick enough, but first of all, I don't want to thin the bottom before I thin the top, because if I take the support of the bottom, the top can start to vibrate and we can get a not perfectly clean cut. But more importantly, how do I know how to turn this down exactly 1/4 of an inch all the way down? And since I have no access to measure it and feel it, I had to come up with another system. So what I do is I take an old trusty egg beater drill here. I don't even know what brand this is. It's a 2-speed. You can shift it so you can go faster or slower with it. And I've got a small drill bit on here, less than 1/8 of an inch or about 1/8 of an inch bit. And I have a piece of masking tape, just a little piece of green masking tape. And I know that this is about 1/4 of an inch, so I'm just going to use that as a reference. And I'm going to set the tape on here and fold it over. And now I know I have about 1/4 of an inch deep tip on my bit. And I'm going to drill a set of pilot holes here. And we're going to use those and turn down to those. So I'm going to drill these over to the side so you can see me drill them. Reason I use the hand drill here. Power drill has got enough torque where the tape can slip. If you don't stop it easily, the tape can mash up in here. So you just have a little more control over it, a little more finesse with the hand drill. Turn right up to that point. And we're just going right down to the edge of the tape, and we're going to set a set of holes all the way down this. You don't get it turned exactly the same depth. What's going to happen is it's going to stick out more at the bottom than on the sides, and so it's not going to be balanced. And so it's also just hard to do. It's hard to turn it down to a certain depth without knowing where you're going. I'll even give myself one last one down here. I can probably eyeball the bottom curve, but it's nice to know that you got it right. Okay. Let's see if you can see those here. So there's a good view of those holes right here. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn from the top down to get rid of those holes. The curvature of the bowl is pretty nice. The top third is easy. The second third is pretty good. When I get to the bottom, I'm starting now to turn into the grain. I'm starting to turn. Let me just move this over here a little bit. There we go. I'm starting now to push downhill into the grain, and it's a harder cut. So I use a small gouge. I use a 3/8 inch gouge because it's cutting less fibers at a time. I keep a fairly conventional rounded tip on it. Okay, it's not a super swept back gouge, all right? It's just a fairly conventional tip on it. And what that allows me to do, flute's facing forward right here, but as I come around, I can lift the flute almost vertical, and use the side of the gouge that has the sharpest edge. So this is where the sharpest part of it is, and I can cut those fibers really, really gently. So I'm not forcing my way into them, I'm not pushing hard, I'm just very gently rolling the gouge around and inching my way in and cutting into the fibers. If I'm cutting something that's a lighter wood, a maple or a sycamore, easy as can be. This acacia is going to take a little bit of work. It's pretty hard wood, so I want to make sure I really get that nice. So we'll set the tool rest in here. And the first thing I'm going to do, you see how this is protruding a little bit? We're going to nibble that away. Because if I take a big bite of this, I could split it, and then it's not going to be supporting all the fibers, and it could potentially fly out on me. So we're just going to get rid of that, and then we're going to turn our way down. So I put my face shield on, which I always turn with, and we'll turn the lathe on. And you'll watch how lightly I take this out. It's super light, and I'm kind of pulling outwards. It's so tempting to want to take a big bite of it and get rid of it all at once. It's just a huge risk of it causing a problem. You just don't want to break it. Okay, so now it should be flush. Now it's nice and flush. You can see how that wave's going to end up looking. And now I can start at the top. First thing I'm going to do is get rid of a little bit of the MDF. Please don't breathe that. Make sure you have a respirator on or hold your breath, because it's just nasty stuff. And then I'm going to turn down to these holes, start with the top third, go to the next third, go to the next third, and hopefully I'll have a nicely shaped finished piece here. Okay. This is going to be my finished surface, so I really want to do careful finish cuts here. I've done this a number of times. I can get to this point pretty quickly. I want you guys to take your time when you do it. You can see I almost got there, so tiny little bit left, not a whole lot left. One more thing, that when I get down to where these are almost gone, they're really hard to find. So I'm going to take a Sharpie and put a mark on the face of this plate here, so I can now look at that line and know that that's where those are, and I can find them easier once I get rid of them. So really, there's not much left there, so I can just do a little shear scraping cut. I recommend you taking a little bit slower than I did. Take less at a time and work your way down it. So I've got rid of those, and now I just have a little bit left there, so I can start to work my way down. All right. So now we're looking, all of these are really nice. A little bit left right there. So when I pick up this cut, I can pick it up behind it and blend it and get it to go the rest of the way down. I'm also looking at the shape here. I'm looking if there's any ridges that I've missed, and I would clean those up. But finished cuts, I want this finished surface to be as good as possible. So I'll move the tool rest around over here. And we'll continue down. So this is where I'm getting the flute really vertical, double riding cut, and going all the way down with it. If you're not rubbing the bevel, you've got a serious risk of attack. It's a catchy cut, but it's also the cleanest part of the gouge, the sharpest part of the gouge. So now we'll take a look here. So I have a little, I can see it, there's a ridge here, and I can see that I've left one there, but most of these are pretty good. So if I just blend right here and probably just do a scraper shear scraping cut. If I use a heavier gouge for the shear scraping cut, it's a little more stable. So handles low, gouge is pointing really straight up here, and we're using the back edge just as a very shear angle to just really lightly take out that one little point there. My eyes are on the back of the bowl, so I'm seeing the shape. And that should just about be it. So right now they're really hard to find because they're hard to see, so I have to go back here to my reference mark and look down here and look how I've done, and I feel pretty good about that. So we could take some time on that, make sure that we're really doing it carefully. And so now this is going to be your finished surface. And in this case, that wood's really pretty, so I'm probably not going to dye it or anything like that. And so I'm going to sand it now. So now is the time when I would come in, and this is obviously not the right sandpaper, but it's what's in front of the lathe here. But if you have a little bit of those holes left, you can usually sand them off. Okay, and we're going to go through all the grits, and we're going to make this really nice and finished. And even to the point where I might even put my first coat of finish on it, whether it's an oil finish or a sanding sealer or something. So it's easier to get the glue off later. And once I just have more access to it now. Once I take this off, bring it back over to the bench and put the other part of the wave back in, I don't have the access to this that I had. All right, so let's go ahead and take it off now. Tool rest out. And I'm going to go ahead and take it out of the chuck right now. So it's easy for me to show you over here. So there's what we've got. And again, you can see the form is pretty nice. And again, it would be sanded and all that. So now we're going to take this apart. And I'm going to grab by the tabs so I don't risk. If I grab up here, I could break them off. If I grab by the tabs, I have less of a risk of breaking them off. This spacer gets taken away. And now we come back to the original sheets. See, I'm pushing them by the tabs. Okay, and put the top on. All right, and now we have hopefully accomplished a protruding wave bowl. I didn't make it stick out very far. Probably might risk at this point putting it back on and going down another 1/8 of an inch, but it's a demo and that's what happens in demos. But you can see by using those pilot holes, it's the same distance sticking out all the way around, and that's real important. Hopefully the bowl's sanded nicely. That's all really smooth and really nice. If you're going to dye something or color something, you want to plan ahead and think about where you're going with it. But you need to do something treatment to this. And I don't want to really mess up where the glue joint's going to happen. I want to keep that as intact as possible. So I'll slide it back on the bowl. So I'll put it back together, and I'll take a pencil. I'll mark around the ring. Okay, so I'm going to mark around it, top and bottom, and we're going to take it apart. Set that aside. And you can see now I've got a pencil mark on here of how far down I need to treat that. And so I want to break the edges. I want to soften the edges. Also, anything up here, there's going to be a little bit of marks from the bandsaw. It's pretty smooth, but bandsaw blade's going to leave a little bit of ridges. So I want to get rid of those. So take a piece of sandpaper, and I take my knuckle on the back of it like this, and take my knuckle up to the bowl, and then set the sandpaper at the right depth. So now this knuckle is traveling around, and now I can sand all those surfaces down. And this can take some time. You can spend a good hour plus on this to get this really nice. So I go out in the lawn chair in the driveway and make myself comfortable, sit out in the sun, and do that top and bottom. Sorry, the pencil line there. And then round the edges over. Okay. And make this pretty. You could cheat your time and use a wood burner and stipple on it and make it black, and that goes probably quicker than sanding it. If you want to dye it, that line's really valuable. So you put the dye on, let the dye bleed just across the line, but not too far in where you're destroying the glue joint. And then you sand off the surface because you'll have raised the grain, and you sand the surface off, and the stain and the pencil line will come off with that. And then the staining of the dye will tell you how far to dye the next layer. So you'll do a second coat of dye that will come up. So it's a slow, kind of tedious process. You want to treat that with care. But you can do all sorts of things to the outside here, design work on it, whatever. So get this right, however you want it. And then we're going to glue it up. And when we glue it up, we go back on the lathe. So it's in the chuck on the lathe. And this ring is bigger than here. So you want to put the glue only on the small joint. So I use these silicone glue brushes because they leave really nice ridges of the glue that when you smush the sides together, they spread out. So I'll glue this. I'll glue one side at a time, and then we'll stack it back together. And then we'll use that plate from the top we used before, and we'll clamp this on the lathe. And while I'm clamping it, I now have access to spin it and get rid of the excess glue. So I'm going to usually use Q-tips, and I come in here and wipe the squeeze out off. Probably about an inch at a time with this Q-tip. Use one, use a second one, wipe it off, flip it over. Once I've gotten all the major squeeze out off, there's still a little bit of residue of glue on there. So now I get the Q-tips wet, and I just dip them real quickly in a cup of water, and I just come in here and just wash the excess glue off, just really lightly. I'm not forcing it into the gap. I'm not forcing water into the joint. I'm just real lightly wiping the glue off. And then I'll take a popsicle stick, and I'll take those cutters, which I set off to the side here. Popsicle stick, and I'll make a scraper out of it. I'll give myself a nice pointy popsicle stick, and I'll come into the joint, and I'll get any glue that's right in that little corner out. I can use it as a scraper this way, or I can just use that tip and just pull the glue out. And as I'm doing that, it's going to leave a little more residue, a little bit more of the glue will have squeezed out. So I'll do one more set of wet Q-tips. So again, I'll just dip them in water real quick, and again, we're just going to wash the glue off. I recommend the Q-tip brand. The ones that have plastic shafts, they just disintegrate too quickly when they get wet. So I could use 100 Q-tips on a bowl, but that's about $1, so it's not a big deal. I glue one joint at a time. So I'm going to glue the bottom joint first. Everything's here. Clamp it. We're going to let that sit on the lathe for an hour at least, so the glue kicks up. And then we're going to take the top off, repeat the process, put it back together. One more little thing I didn't talk about, and I want to add this in for you. On this piece here, you'll notice on the inside, there's the joint that was cut has been accented by a veneer. So I've actually put a light colored veneer into the joint, so it sells the design inside and out. It carries this light color on the inside and sells the design on the inside. If you want to do that, you take it before you glue it up, and you got it in pieces here. You glue the veneer onto this surface here. So I'll put a little veneer that's cut slightly proud, stack it back onto the lathe with all the parts, clamp it, and then I'll do the same thing on the top. Put the veneer on the top, stack it all back on the lathe, clamp it all together that way, and then we just take the ring out, trim the veneer, smooth as we can, blend it in, and then when we glue the whole piece, that veneer will show up in the gap of the glue joint, and it'll give you a nice little accented design on the inside. Removing these blocks. The reason I do them out of MDF is that they're easier to remove. Put it back together here for you. So the first thing I'm going to do is just grab them with some channel lock pliers and wiggle them and see if they break out easily. Because I've cut them in 3 pieces, these would come off pretty simple. Going to see if that happens. Not too much pressure, because you can actually break the tendon off. You can pull the bowl out of the chuck if you're really jamming on it with a channel locks. So I do my best to break them off, and then I just turn them away. And the reason for the MDF, again, it's lighter wood. As all this air and the gouge hits each side of it, the MDF's soft enough where the gouge will go right through it. If they were harder wood and the wood had the grain going this way, then they're more difficult to deal with. You have to turn them away with like in grain and then turn the bowl face grain. So there's just, if it's easiest just get rid of them with turning tools, break them off, and then you use turning tools. So yeah, that's how I do it. That's why I do it with the MDF. And finally, just finish turning the inside and the bottom as you would any bowl. Thank you for watching my video. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions.